Howdy, students. This video was recorded by Ms. Lily Wu, TAMU class of 2024, as part of an honors project for GEOS 210. Lily, take it away.
Howdy, students. In this video, we will be talking about decisions under uncertainty. In the previous 13 chapters, we looked at the physics that leads us to confidently conclude that humans are changing the climate. While we are certain humans are changing the climate, we do not know how much future warming we are in store for. In Chapter 8, you saw a range of possible futures that, as described by the SSP emissions scenarios. In addition to this uncertainty in emissions, we do not know how bad any particular level of warming will be for society. Some people may be able to effectively adapt to 3 degrees Celsius of warming, for example, while others will not. Thus, we're faced with huge uncertainty in how serious of a threat climate change is. So what's the best way to make decisions in the face of such uncertainty? We can consider the 2 following approaches. 1, take action now, even though we don't know how bad climate change will be, or wait until we're certain that climate change is serious before taking action. Both statements argue that we must err on the side of caution in order to avoid a bad outcome. However, the bad outcome is different for both scenarios. In the first one, the bad outcome is severe damage from unavoided climate change, whereas in the second, it is severe economic damage from responding too strenuously to climate change. So given these 2 arguments, which one is correct? Let's look at a few examples of decision-making under uncertainty. So the first one we can think about is a criminal trial. So in this venue, there are 2 errors a jury can make. They can convict an innocent person, or they can acquit a guilty person. As a society, we have decided that the worst error is convicting an innocent person. This is why juries must be convinced that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt seeks to minimize the chance of making what we judge to be the worst mistake, which is convicting an innocent person. Another example we can look at is a civil trial. So unlike a criminal trial where someone's freedom is on the line, civil trials are typically disputes where the stakes are lower. Let's say your neighbor built their fence on your property. You might want to sue them, and if you win, they would be ordered to move it. But if they won, then they wouldn't move it. So as with the criminal trial, there are 2 errors we can make. We can wrongly fine for the plaintiff, which is the person suing, or we can wrongly fine for the defendant, which is the person being sued. In this case, our society has judged that these errors are roughly equivalent. There's no reason to think that finding an error for the plaintiff is worse than finding an error for the defendant. Because of this, the standard for a civil trial is preponderance of evidence, meaning that if 51% of the evidence supports one side, then you find in favor of that side. So in other words, you only need a majority of the evidence to win the case. So let's look at one last example, and this one's a little bit more fun. Let's say that Superman learns that there is a 1% chance that his villains have a piece of kryptonite. So kryptonite is very dangerous to Superman, and it can kill him. So how should he respond? In this case, there are 2 errors that Superman can make. He can take action to head off this risk, but later find out that the villains didn't have any kryptonite. Or he can ignore the risk and not take action and later find out that the villains did have kryptonite. So here, Superman would probably conclude that the worst mistake is not taking action and finding out that they did have kryptonite. So even if there's a small chance of getting killed, it's better to over-prepare than under-prepare. Thus, if there's almost any chance of the villains having kryptonite, Superman should take action as if it were a certainty. Now let's relate this to climate change. Do we need to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt that it is a serious threat before taking action to reduce emissions, like in a criminal trial? Or do we take action even if there is just a 1% chance that it is a serious threat, like in Superman's case? This ultimately boils down to your judgment of which of these errors is worse: reducing emissions unnecessarily because climate change turns out to be a minor threat, or not reducing emissions and climate change turning out to be a serious threat. First, let's suppose that climate change turns out to be a minor problem. In this case, we spent a lot of money to rebuild our energy infrastructure from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So would this transition be all that bad? Some advantages of switching are unrelated to climate, such as better air quality. Additionally, the cost of transitioning would be spread over the next several decades, so some of the costs can actually be scaled back if we learn that they are unnecessary. And then fossil fuels will run out eventually in the next century or so. So switching to renewable energy is inevitable. It's hard to imagine a person in 2050 being upset that we switched from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So now let's look at the other error. Suppose that climate change turns out to be a severe problem, and it's the worst case scenario. If we do nothing to reduce emissions, we doom the planet to much warmer temperatures for thousands of years. As we talked about in Chapter 9, this would be catastrophic. In this case, it is easy to imagine a person in the future being furious that we did nothing to address climate change, even though we saw it coming. And another factor we can consider is irreversibility. If an action is irreversible, you have to be very certain that it's the right thing to do. You don't want to make a mistake you might regret in the future. So reducing emissions is reversible. If we decide that climate change is not serious in the future, we can always increase our consumption of fossil fuels later. And the same goes for renewable energy. We can scale those back if necessary. However, the converse is not true. Carbon dioxide emissions are not reversible. Once we emit that into the atmosphere, it remains there for a long time. We have therefore committed the planet to millennia of higher temperatures or some form of geoengineering or carbon capture from the atmosphere. Many of the impacts of climate change are also irreversible, such as sea level rise and loss of ice sheets. Thus, the irreversibility of emitted carbon dioxide and its associated impacts tend to favor taking action to reduce emissions. So putting everything together, most world governments have concluded that, despite uncertainties, the world should take action to address climate change. In the next video, we will be looking at what we should do if we decide to take action on climate. And now, your moment of cat.